Well, I think you're going to find our next guest to be absolutely fascinating. He's authored a book called The Setting Sun, or Setting Sun, The End of the U.S. Economic Dominance. There's a picture of it on the screen. You may want to check it out at Barnes & Noble or online at Amazon. Brandon Adams is with us today, graduate of the University of Florida at the age of 19. Went on to get his master's degree and his PhD at Harvard, and ended up turning around and teaching at Harvard. He deals with the subject of finance, behavioral finance, all of it. And this book, I think, what's so interesting about this book, by the way, hi, Brandon.
Hey, thanks a lot for having me.
I was looking at the back of your book. I was thumbing through it, and I go, wait a minute, you got more in your references than you do in the front. You really did your research on this.
Well, that's because the book was 4 years in the making.
Really? So, wow.
So hey, over 4 years, you add a lot of footnotes and a lot of references.
Boy, I tell you, the footnotes are just unbelievable. Hey, by the way, nice to have you. Thanks for giving us a few moments of your time. And I know you're concerned about the cultural shifts and the economic condition of our country. Let me ask you this: Are we in a mess, a financial mess, because of the culture, or is the economy affecting the culture affecting the economy?
Yeah, I think it's tough to disentangle, but I definitely think it's a question that's not given enough time, not given enough importance. The question of how the culture interacts with the economy. Academic economists certainly stay away from that question, but I think it's central to what's going on. And in fact, I have a chapter in my book called "The Economic Consequences of Cultural Decline," which talks about the interaction of culture and economics. And a couple of the things I mentioned in that chapter, I mentioned the decline in attention spans that comes with the fracturing of people's attention driven by technology and media, and the need for the constant stimulation that comes with media. I talk a bit about the decline in trust levels. Historically, one of the major benefits of the U.S. economy is that there's been a lot of trust within communities, and people would meet and then start productive enterprises shortly thereafter. Mm-hmm. I think some of that trust has gone away. The famous book "Bowling Alone" by Robert Putnam that documents the decline in community associations of all kinds. I think that kind of phenomenon has only become exaggerated with technology. People just are spending most of their time in front of their computers. And then I talk about the decline in savings rates broadly construed. So I'm talking less about actual financial savings and more about sort of deferred gratification, more about making sacrifices today for the benefit of tomorrow. I think that spirit has gone away to a tremendous extent. Mm-hmm. And I think you can see it in a lot of social indicators that aren't given much thought. Like, for instance, obesity is clearly one where you're consuming today and hurting yourself tomorrow. I even mentioned things like tattoos, which I would consider sort of a social signaling device that you kind of want to signal that you live for the day because you think that it's beneficial to signal that you live for the day. Right. But it's clearly like a detrimental thing long term. And I think to the extent that culture interacts with economics, this fact, the decline in savings rates, the inability to sacrifice today for tomorrow is probably the central thing. And of course, as it relates to finances, debt is one way that you can sacrifice tomorrow for the benefit of today. So I don't think it's an accident that we have high debt levels.
Well, let's go to that question. How did we go from being this incredibly powerful nation that was a lender to now we're the borrower and now we're the slave to the lender?
Well, it was a long process, and the mechanics of it are that after you've gone from, say, the Mad Men era, to throw a popular cultural reference out there, where you're kind of the dominant player in the international scene, sort of like, let's say, mid 60s. After you go from that dominant economic power to something more akin to the late 70s, where you're starting to lose your position in the international economy, you're still deriving benefit from the fact that you were the dominant economic power in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of the international trading regime, what happens is in the 50s and early 60s, you're running current account surpluses. you're building up assets in the rest of the world. So as we run big current account surpluses, we settle that account every year by taking ownership in the rest of the world's assets. And we can benefit from that in years like the late 70s, early 80s, where we're running current account deficits. We're kind of drawing down those credits, and we've gotten to a point where we've drawn down most of our credits, and we're in a relatively bad spot.
So what happens now, Brandon? I mean, we can't sustain this debt, 16 trillion and growing, and the mindset of the current administration is you spend more. I mean, we've lost our minds. I mean, is this thing, can it be recovered, or are we going to hit a wall? What's going to happen, in your opinion?
Well, the story I tell in Setting Sun is one where we can recover, but we would have to change things, and we would have to get a bit lucky in a way. But the more likely outcome is that we don't recover, and we do suffer some pretty stiff consequences, and we have some element of kind of social and political problems.
What does that look like? I mean, what financial wall are we going to hit, in your opinion? I mean, we can't pay the debt, so what do? We give China California in exchange? I mean, what do we do?
It's funny. That's the story that's told in the book 2030 by Albert Brooks.
Yeah.
The actor, he wrote a book called 2030, in which he tries to envision life in the future, and he in that fictional world, California has been sold to China. It's a pretty funny book, actually.
Oh boy. Well, I said that in tongue in cheek, but we can't service the debt. So what happened? But you know what? The other thing apart of this is so interesting. I don't know, of all of the big first world, second worlds out there, it seems like all the economies are upside down. So who's going to own who when it's all over?
Well, I think it's just going to be a turbulent period. The popular book, This Time is Different, by Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhardt, they talk about the strong tendency for nations to struggle at the same time. So you have these short, dramatic periods in history where you have many countries defaulting and having serious issues at the same time. And at the tail end of that book, This Time is Different, they suggest that we're about to enter into one of those periods. And what happens is every country is worse off due to the fact that other countries are struggling as well. So a popular thing to do is to compare the U.S. to Japan and to suggest that the U.S. can in fact run huge deficits for a very long time because Japan's been able to do that and things are relatively okay there. Wow. So in other words, Japan's debt to GDP is like 230% and ours is closer to 90%. So they suggest that we have a lot of runway to go. I think this is a horrible comparison, and in fact, the U.S. doesn't have very much runway. The reason it's a horrible comparison is, firstly, Japan has had a strong history of current account surpluses. They have a more vibrant export sector than we do. And all else equal, you're able to borrow more when you have an export sector. In our case, we're running deficits of $500 billion a year on the current account and importing $300 billion a year in oil. So that's a major difference. Another major difference is they have high domestic national savings in Japan, whereas we have very low savings.
Okay.
Another difference is there are 80 million people worth 300 plus million people. And another difference is at the time that Japan was borrowing, the rest of the world was doing quite well.
Mm-hmm.
So their bubble sort of started deflating around 1989. So the 90s were a very rough decade for them. But as we know, the 90s were a strong decade for all of the other economies.
Wow.
So it's relatively easy to borrow, whereas now, if you need to borrow, there are plenty of other people wanting to borrow at the same time. It's a much more difficult matter.
Well, let me encourage you to check it out. It's called Setting Sun, The End of the U.S. Economy or Economic Dominance by Brandon Adams. And he has well footnoted his research here, 4 years in the making. I think you'll find it to be a very informative read. Thank you, Brandon. It's very complicated, and let's keep an eye on it, and we'll have you back, okay?
All right. Thanks very much for having me.
All right. Talk to you soon. We'll be right back.